On a crisp Saturday afternoon, the buzz of the local department store hummed steadily in the background. Shoppers moved up and down the aisles, some chatting, others simply focused on checking off their lists. It was the kind of day that felt ordinary, uneventful, even. But just a few steps past the entrance, something was brewing that no one could have anticipated. Near the seasonal decor section, a woman in her late 40s, her heels clicking against the tiled floor, paused to examine a display of festive wreaths. Her posture was rigid, her expression sharp, and her tone clipped as she muttered loudly enough for those nearby to hear. She wore a tailored blazer, her designer purse slung over one arm, and her whole demeanor screamed self-importance. To most passers-by, she looked like just another shopper, but anyone who had been close enough to hear her comments knew there was something more to her presence, something unsettling. A few feet away, a young woman with smooth, dark skin and an effortless grace stood browsing a selection of candles. She was humming softly to herself, a tune that carried the kind of warmth that made you stop and take notice. Her simple yet elegant outfit reflected her easy confidence, and she seemed entirely unbothered by the rush around her. That is, until the woman from the wreath display suddenly turned toward her with a pointed glare. The first comment was muttered under the woman's breath, almost as if testing the waters. It was vague enough that anyone else might not have caught its intent, but the young woman stiffened ever so slightly. Still, she kept her composure, refusing to engage, her fingers lightly grazing the candle jars as if nothing had been said. But the older woman wasn't satisfied with being ignored. Louder this time, she made another remark, this one unmistakably cutting, laced with disdain. Heads began to turn. A couple nearby exchanged uneasy glances but stayed rooted to their spot. It was the kind of situation that could spiral in an instant, and everyone around seemed to sense it. The young woman turned slowly, meeting the gaze of her aggressor. Her expression was calm, but her eyes burned with quiet resolve. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice steady, even kind, as if giving the other woman a chance to reconsider her words. But there was no backing down for the older woman. Instead, she doubled down, her words dripping with condescension. She threw out stereotypes as if they were facts, her tone growing harsher with each sentence. "People like you," she began, gesturing vaguely with one manicured hand, as if the mere presence of the young woman offended her. The air grew heavier with every passing second. Customers whispered among themselves, unsure of what to do. Some looked on in shock, others in anger, and a few quietly slipped away, not wanting to get involved. But the young woman stood her ground, her chin lifting slightly as she prepared to respond. What happened next was something no one expected, not even the older woman. It wasn't just a response, it was a reckoning. And as the tension reached its peak, the store's PA system crackled, signaling an announcement that would change the dynamic of the entire scene. The crowd shifted, their attention momentarily divided, but one thing was clear: the balance of power in that moment was about to shift, and it wouldn't end the way anyone thought. This is the story of how a careless insult became a life-altering moment. It's about resilience, about standing up in the face of ignorance, and about the power of holding your head high even when others try to drag you down. What started as an ugly confrontation would soon take a turn no one could have seen coming. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The room fell silent, save for the occasional rustling of shopping bags and the hum of the store's fluorescent lights. All eyes shifted between the two women, the tension between them almost palpable. The older woman, her face now flushed with a mix of anger and self-righteousness, crossed her arms tightly across her chest, as if to fortify her position. The younger woman, however, didn't flinch. She stood firm, her steady gaze locked on the other's face, though her hands were clenched tightly at her sides. For a moment, it seemed like she wouldn't respond, like she might let the insults hang in the air and dissolve. But then, slowly, she took a small step forward, her voice calm but commanding enough to cut through the thick silence. "I think you've said enough," she stated plainly. Her words weren't loud, but they carried weight. The older woman scoffed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed through the aisle. Oh, I've said enough? Maybe you're not used to people calling you out. But trust me, someone had to say it. She gestured broadly, as if to the entire store. Some of us still have standards. The younger woman raised an eyebrow, her expression a mixture of disbelief and defiance. Standards? She echoed. Her voice remained steady, though there was a slight edge to it now. Interesting word choice, considering how you've been behaving. More murmurs rippled through the growing crowd of onlookers. By now, at least a dozen shoppers had gathered nearby, some pretending to browse the shelves while others openly watched the unfolding drama. A store associate hovered nervously by the edge of the crowd, clutching a radio and glancing between the two women, clearly unsure whether to intervene. The older woman, emboldened by the attention, threw her hands up in exasperation. Unbelievable, she muttered, shaking her head. This is exactly what I'm talking about. No respect, no decency. Just look at the way you're speaking to me. Her voice rose slightly, her words clearly intended to sway the crowd to her side. But the crowd wasn't biting. A few people exchanged glances, their expressions skeptical, even disapproving. Someone near the back of the group muttered, "What's her problem?" But the comment was too low for the older woman to hear. The younger woman didn't waver. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying her adversary with an almost curious expression. Respect goes both ways, she said simply. Maybe you should think about that. For a split second, something flickered across the older woman's face. Was it guilt? Doubt? Whatever it was, it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a hardened glare. Don't lecture me, she snapped. I don't need a lesson in manners, especially not from someone like you. There it was again, someone like you. The words hung in the air like a bad smell, unmistakable in their meaning. This time, a visible ripple of discomfort passed through the crowd. A middle-aged man standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the two women. A younger shopper, earbuds dangling from her neck, folded her arms and frowned, clearly unimpressed. The younger woman's expression didn't change, but her posture stiffened slightly, her shoulders squaring. I don't know what you think you're accomplishing here, she said, her voice quieter now but no less resolute. But I'm not going to let you talk to me like that. The older woman opened her mouth to retort, but before she could, a deep voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? Everyone turned toward the source of the voice. A tall man in a navy blue store uniform had appeared at the end of the aisle, his expression calm but authoritative. He walked toward the group with measured steps, his gaze shifting between the two women. The older woman immediately straightened, her demeanor shifting as if she were the aggrieved party in the situation. Yes, there's a problem, she said, her tone suddenly saccharine. I was just trying to shop, and this young lady started causing a scene. The younger woman's eyebrows shot up in disbelief, but she said nothing, clearly unwilling to stoop to the same level. Instead, she turned to the store employee, her expression steady. That's not what happened, she said simply. She's been making inappropriate comments since I got here. The man in the uniform held up a hand, signaling for both women to pause. Let's keep it civil, please, he said. His tone was neutral, but there was an undercurrent of authority that suggested he wouldn't tolerate any nonsense. Ma'am, he said, turning to the older woman, can you tell me exactly what's going on? The older woman launched into a convoluted explanation, her voice dripping with indignation. She painted herself as the victim, exaggerating details and conveniently omitting her own inflammatory remarks. The younger woman stood silently, her arms crossed, waiting for her turn to speak. When the older woman finally finished, the employee turned to the younger woman. And what about you? He asked. What's your side of the story? She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice measured and calm. I was minding my own business, looking at the candles, she began. She approached me and started making comments. I ignored her at first, but she didn't stop. That's when I asked her to stop, and things escalated. The man nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. He glanced around at the gathered crowd, as if gauging their reactions. Did anyone here witness what happened? He asked, addressing the bystanders. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension in the air was thick, and it was clear that no one wanted to be the first to get involved. But then, a voice broke the silence. I saw it, said a young woman near the back of the group. She stepped forward hesitantly, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. She's telling the truth. The other lady started it. The older woman's face turned an alarming shade of red. Excuse me? She sputtered, rounding on the newcomer. You don't know what you're talking about. I know what I heard, the young woman replied, her voice steady. And you were out of line. The crowd murmured in agreement, and a few other voices chimed in to corroborate the younger woman's account. The older woman looked around, her indignation giving way to something that looked suspiciously like panic. The store employee raised a hand again, silencing the growing chatter. All right, he said firmly. That's enough. Let's not turn this into more of a spectacle than it already is. But the situation was far from over. As the man in the uniform tried to diffuse the tension, a figure emerged from the back of the crowd, phone in hand, the camera already rolling. The crowd shifted, making way for the person with the phone, and the tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. The older woman's eyes widened when she saw the camera, her expression shifting from anger to something closer to fear. What do you think you're doing? She demanded, her voice rising. The person with the phone didn't respond, but the message was clear: the entire confrontation had just gone public. The camera's lens flashed briefly, capturing the older woman's face twisted in frustration and disbelief. Her eyes narrowed, her lips pressed tightly together, as she watched the person behind the phone record every moment. She had clearly underestimated how far this situation could escalate. The power dynamic that she'd once controlled so confidently now seemed to be slipping away, piece by piece. Are you really going to record this? She demanded, her voice dripping with condescension. Do you think you're helping? The young woman with the phone didn't respond, her fingers steady on the screen as she panned it over the older woman's face, capturing the expression of disdain that she could no longer hide. The phone's recording light blinked a few times, signaling to the crowd that the situation was being documented. It wasn't just about the confrontation anymore. It was about power, control, and how a single moment could ripple outward, far beyond the aisles of a department store. The older woman had assumed she could wield her influence with a few sharp words, but now, she was on the defensive. It was the young woman who had become the one with control, simply by standing up for herself. The man in the store uniform looked between the two, his gaze shifting to the growing group of onlookers. He could feel the eyes of the store weighing on him, each person silently expecting him to bring the situation to a close. But there was no easy resolution, not when the woman in front of him seemed to be more interested in defending her pride than actually resolving the conflict. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying a note of authority that had been missing up until now. Ma'am, he said, addressing the older woman, we don't allow recording without consent in here. You need to stop that now. The woman with the phone paused, glancing at the man but refusing to lower the camera. She's been insulting her, she said, her tone flat, but unwavering. I'm just making sure people see the truth. The crowd, which had been eerily quiet moments ago, now murmured in agreement. Whispers of "she deserves to be called out, and it's about time someone stood up to her" circulated, but the older woman couldn't seem to comprehend what was happening. She stood frozen for a moment, trying to gauge her next move. The crowd's judgment was a powerful force, and she realized, belatedly, that she wasn't in control anymore. I won't be spoken to like this, the older woman finally hissed, looking from the phone back to the employee. You have no right to let her do this. The employee remained calm, his voice soft yet firm. I understand that you're upset, but escalating this further isn't going to help. Let's just take a breath, and we'll sort this out. But it wasn't that simple. The tension had built to a boiling point, and the crowd wasn't going to let it simmer down without seeing some kind of resolution. The woman with the phone, emboldened by the support from the onlookers, kept filming, her camera steady and unwavering. I've had enough of this, the older woman snapped, looking around the crowd as if searching for an ally, a voice of reason to help her regain the upper hand. But the faces she saw only confirmed what she feared most: no one was on her side. The crowd was no longer just watching, they were judging. At the same time, the young woman stood her ground, her expression unmoving. She wasn't looking for applause or validation from the crowd. Her focus remained entirely on the older woman, a quiet defiance simmering in her gaze. She had already won, not in the eyes of the store or the other shoppers, but in her own mind. She had faced the insult, stood tall, and refused to cower. That was enough for her. However, the conflict wasn't limited to this one aisle, this one moment. In a way, the confrontation had already sparked something larger than any of them realized. The older woman's words had triggered something deep within the young woman, something she hadn't known was buried beneath the surface. The young woman wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for something much bigger, a lifetime of quiet resentment, of having to navigate the world while being judged, misunderstood, and ignored. It wasn't just about this one encounter in a department store. It was about a lifetime of people thinking they could define her, of making assumptions without truly seeing who she was. She could feel the weight of it now, the pressure that had built up over the years. And with each word spoken, each accusation thrown her way, she could feel that weight shifting, lightening. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of how others saw her. She wasn't afraid of being diminished or silenced. She was reclaiming her own space, her own voice. But that didn't mean the battle was over. It was just beginning. As the crowd continued to murmur and the camera clicked on, the store employee turned his attention back to the older woman, who was now visibly agitated. Her arms were flailing, her face flushed with the kind of anger that comes from a person realizing they have lost control. You'll regret this, she said, her voice tight with barely contained fury. You'll see. People like you always cause trouble. Always ruin things for everyone else. The words were sharp, biting, but they were also hollow. There was no conviction in them anymore, only fear. The fear of being exposed. Of being seen for who she truly was. I'm not causing trouble, the young woman replied, her voice steady as she met the older woman's gaze. I'm just standing up for myself. And you can't take that away from me. The crowd was still gathering, the space around the two women thick with anticipation. Some people had already begun to record their own videos, capturing the scene from every angle. The store employee had no choice but to remain a passive observer, unsure of how to defuse the situation without making it worse. Behind the cameras and the tension, the older woman's mind raced. How had it come to this? How had she lost control of a situation she should have easily been able to dominate? The answers were fleeting, but there was one thing she knew for certain: her world had just shifted. And she wasn't sure she could get it back. But as she stood there, looking at the young woman, the cameras, and the crowd, the conflict was far from over. The older woman wasn't done fighting. She couldn't be. The shame of being challenged in such a public way felt unbearable, and she wasn't ready to let this moment define her. Either of them were. The silence between them grew, the tension hanging thick like smoke. The store's PA system crackled once more, but it was just another layer of noise in the chaos of this moment. Either of them noticed it as they stared each other down. Something had shifted, something inside both of them, and it wasn't just about who would win in this moment. It was about who they were becoming in this unfolding drama. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. The tension in the store had reached its boiling point, and it felt like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something to give. The older woman's face was a mask of barely contained fury, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts as she glared at the young woman in front of her. The crowd had quieted, their eyes fixed on the confrontation as if it were a live performance, everyone on edge, unsure of what was going to happen next. The store employee stood a few feet away, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. His earlier attempt to mediate the situation had failed, and now he was a spectator just like everyone else, helpless to stop the escalating drama. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the older woman cut him off with a wave of her hand. "I don't need anyone to defend me," she snapped, her voice sharp. She turned back to the younger woman, her eyes narrowing. "You think you're so much better than me, don't you?" Her words were cold, calculated, dripping with venom. "People like you always think they can do whatever they want, get away with it. You're no different." The crowd was quiet, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. No one dared to speak. The young woman stood unmoving, her expression still calm, but there was a fire behind her eyes. She hadn't come this far to back down now. But something in her was different, stronger. She wasn't the same person who had walked into the store just moments ago, browsing aisles and humming to herself. This moment had changed her, and she could feel it in her bones. "You have no idea what you're talking about," the young woman replied, her voice low, but the words were filled with resolve. Her body was tense, every muscle wound tight, but she stood her ground. "I don't need to prove anything to you or anyone else. I'm not here for your approval. I'm here because you crossed a line." The older woman's lips twisted into a sneer. "You're delusional if you think that's going to stop me," she retorted, her tone mocking. "You think you can just stand there and say whatever you want, and people will listen? You're nothing. Just like all the rest." The words stung, but the young woman didn't let it show. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, fighting the surge of emotions that threatened to break free. But she wasn't going to give the older woman the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Her mind was racing now, a mix of anger and clarity flooding her thoughts. She had been quiet for so long, always holding her tongue, always choosing peace over confrontation. But now, with every insult, with every word the older woman threw at her, something snapped. She wasn't going to let it slide anymore. This was the moment she had been waiting for, whether she realized it or not. This wasn't just about standing up to a stranger in a store. This was about reclaiming her power, her voice, and her space in a world that often tried to silence her. The crowd around them had begun to shift again. People were no longer just passive observers. Some of them had stepped closer, their phones raised higher, capturing every word, every gesture. It was no longer just a confrontation between two women. It had become a public spectacle. The older woman's face was flushed, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and fury, but she couldn't stop herself now. Her pride had been wounded, and her fear of being exposed only fueled her anger. "Do you really think they'll believe you?" The older woman sneered, her voice louder now, hoping the force of her words would sway the crowd in her favor. "You think these people care about your little sob story? No one cares about you. You're just another victim playing the race card." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The young woman froze for a split second, the blood draining from her face. She had heard these kinds of words before, from different people, in different places, but hearing them here, in this moment, it cut deeper than anything before. It was a moment of reckoning, one that was more painful than she had anticipated. But then, as quickly as it came, the moment passed. She didn't let the insult consume her. Instead, she stood tall, her posture even more resolute. She wasn't going to let this woman, this stranger, define her. Is that what you really think? The young woman asked, her voice steady again. That's how little you see me? That's how little you see people like me? The older woman's lips curled into a tight smile, and she took a small step forward. She was closing in now, her presence suffocating, but the young woman refused to take a step back. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the storm to break, waiting for the next word, the next move, the next insult or revelation. It felt like the air itself had become charged with electricity, thick with unresolved tension. In the background, the store employee shifted uneasily on his feet, sensing the situation slipping further out of his control. He glanced toward the nearest security camera, wondering if this was the moment when someone would call for help, when the situation would spiral into something more dangerous. But it wasn't his place to intervene directly anymore. Not without making things worse. He stood frozen, his gaze flicking between the two women, unsure of how this would end. Suddenly, the older woman laughed, a bitter, high-pitched sound that cut through the silence like a knife. It was a laugh of desperation, of someone who was losing ground but trying desperately to regain it. "You're all the same," she muttered, her voice quivering with frustration. "All of you, playing the victim." The words stung again, but they also made something inside the young woman click. It was a final insult, a moment that solidified everything she had been trying to tell herself. That was the truth, wasn't it? That was what she had been dealing with all her life, this dismissal, this assumption that she was less than, that she was always the one in the wrong. But now, she wasn't going to let anyone tell her who she was anymore. The young woman looked around at the faces watching her, the phones, the whispers. The realization hit her like a wave: this wasn't just her fight anymore. This wasn't just a matter of pride or principle. This was about everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, everyone who had ever been told to stay in their place, to be silent, to accept the status quo. And just like that, the air seemed to crackle, the energy shifting. It wasn't just about the confrontation between these two women. It was bigger. It was about everything that had led them to this moment. The older woman, sensing her position slipping away, stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. She was losing control. The crowd was no longer on her side. The judgment was clear on their faces. But it wasn't enough to make her stop. Her eyes flashed with something darker now, something desperate. "I'll make sure you regret this," she hissed, her words low and venomous, meant to carry weight, but they seemed almost insignificant in the face of everything that had been said. The young woman didn't flinch. She was done with being afraid. Done with being pushed into the background. She was standing here, now, in this moment, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. And then, just when it seemed like everything would boil over, a voice cut through the tension, louder than anything that had come before. It wasn't the store employee. It wasn't anyone in the crowd. It was a voice that no one expected to hear. Just as the older woman's words hung in the air, a voice suddenly cut through the tension, sharp and commanding, like a crack of thunder in a storm. "Enough." The crowd turned, some even gasped, as a figure stepped into the scene, their presence demanding attention. It wasn't the store manager, nor another employee, it was someone completely unexpected. A man, tall and dressed in a business suit, his face calm but determined, walked straight toward the center of the confrontation. The young woman's gaze flicked to him, confused, unsure of who he was or why he had stepped in. The older woman, momentarily startled by the interruption, looked him up and down, a flash of recognition crossing her face. "What do you want?" she snapped, trying to regain her footing, her voice still laced with irritation. The man's expression remained unreadable as he approached the scene. He didn't respond directly to her question. Instead, his eyes swept over the group of people standing by, his gaze briefly landing on the young woman holding the phone. He gave a subtle nod toward her, signaling her to stop recording. Put that down, he said, his voice more measured, but with an underlying edge that made it clear he wasn't to be ignored. The young woman hesitated. She hadn't expected someone to take control of the situation in such a direct way. She had been holding the phone, capturing every moment of the older woman's insults, the rising tension, but this man's presence made her uneasy. Something about the way he spoke, the authority he wielded, felt different from the store employee. He wasn't here to mediate, he was here to take charge. The older woman's smirk deepened, as if she just found an ally in the stranger. See? She sneered at the young woman. People like you just don't get it. You can't win. But the man didn't acknowledge the older woman's words. Instead, he fixed his eyes on the young woman and gestured once more to her phone. It's for your own good, he said, his tone shifting now to something more ominous. There was a pause, just a moment, where everyone seemed to hold their breath. The crowd, the employees, the onlookers, all of them waited for the young woman to react. Was she going to obey this stranger? Or would she continue to fight back? The young woman's fingers tightened around the phone. She wasn't ready to back down. Not now. Not after everything. But something in the man's gaze made her hesitate. There was something more at play here, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. What are you talking about? She asked, finally finding her voice again. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, but the man's presence loomed larger now. Who are you, and why are you telling me what to do? The man remained silent for a moment, then took a step closer. His voice dropped lower, almost to a whisper, but it carried clearly across the tense space. This isn't about what you think it is. Put the phone down, and I'll make sure you don't regret it. The words hit her with a strange weight. It wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. But a threat of what? The man wasn't in a uniform. He didn't seem to belong to the store at all. His polished shoes clicked against the floor as he stood still, waiting for her decision, his hands clasped in front of him. Something didn't feel right. The air had shifted again. He wasn't just a random person trying to intervene, he was someone who knew exactly what he was doing. And that knowledge, that control, made her skin crawl. Behind her, the older woman stood straighter, emboldened by the man's presence. See? Even they understand. You don't belong here. You should have never started this. But it wasn't just the older woman's voice that was growing louder now. The murmurs in the crowd had intensified. Some of the onlookers were whispering among themselves, their voices tinged with uncertainty. There were too many eyes, too many cameras. As if on cue, the man's voice broke through once more, sharper than before. You're out of your depth. The young woman could feel the walls closing in on her. What had started as a simple confrontation, a single moment of standing up for herself, had turned into something much more complicated. The man had changed the stakes. He wasn't just a bystander. He was someone with a plan, and the young woman had no idea how she fit into it. The crowd had begun to whisper more urgently now. Some people were speaking in hushed tones, casting uncertain glances between the young woman and the man. The store employee, clearly out of his depth, hovered near the edges of the scene, looking more like a spectator than someone in charge. And that was when it hit her. The man wasn't just some stranger stepping in to stop the fight, he was trying to control the narrative. He was trying to steer the situation in a direction that favored the older woman, that put her back in control of the situation. Why else would he be so insistent that she stop filming? Why else would he be so determined to quiet her, to make sure no one could see what was really happening? The fear began to grow in the pit of her stomach, but there was something else there, something stronger. She wasn't just afraid anymore. She was angry. Angry that someone like him thought he could just walk in and make all of this go away. Angry that this woman, this stranger, thought she could keep hurting people and not face any consequences. I'm not putting it down, she said firmly, the phone still raised, her finger ready to press record again. The man didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed. "You'll regret this," he said again, his voice colder now, his body language suddenly far more menacing. Just as the words left his lips, the unexpected happened. The store's front doors swung open with a sudden, jarring force. Several people burst into the store, moving quickly, almost too quickly for the crowd to process. They weren't shoppers, they weren't employees, no, they were security, and they were here for something else entirely. The tension in the store erupted into chaos. The young woman's heart raced as she tried to make sense of the new players who had entered the scene. Were they there to help? Or was this the escalation she had feared all along? With no time to think, the man made his move, signaling to the security team. The older woman smirked, her eyes gleaming with an almost triumphant look. The crowd, now fully engaged, began to murmur in disbelief, the whispers growing louder, the atmosphere thick with confusion and anticipation. And then, as the new arrivals took their places, the tension hit its peak. Everything was about to change. The chaos in the store reached a deafening crescendo. The security team, now positioned at various points around the entrance, moved toward the scene with swift authority. Their presence seemed to amplify the tension, each step they took echoing through the now silent room. The older woman, her smugness giving way to confusion, backed away slightly as the security guards closed in on the group. The young woman, still gripping her phone, stood firm. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing to make sense of everything happening around her. Had this man orchestrated all of this? Was he really connected to the security guards? Was it all a setup? One of the security guards, a tall woman with short, cropped hair, approached the man in the suit, her face tight with professionalism. She glanced toward the young woman briefly, then turned back to the man. "Is everything under control, sir?" The man's expression didn't shift. He gave a short nod, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes. But make sure this doesn't escalate further," he said, his voice quiet but authoritative. The security guard's eyes flicked briefly to the older woman, her stance still rigid, before she nodded and moved toward the young woman. The older woman's confidence was starting to crack now. Her eyes darted around the store, trying to make sense of what was unfolding. "What's going on here?" "I haven't done anything wrong," she muttered, a hint of fear creeping into her voice. Her hands trembled slightly as she crossed them over her chest, her previous bravado slipping away in the face of the growing pressure. The young woman didn't respond immediately. She was still processing everything, trying to figure out if this was really the end of it, or if there was another twist waiting just out of sight. The man in the suit was standing at the center of the scene, his presence looming over everyone, but there was something else in his demeanor now. Something unsettling. The security guard who had approached the man turned to the older woman. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises," she said calmly, her tone cold but controlled. The crowd seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the older woman to argue, to make one last stand. But she didn't. Her eyes widened in disbelief, as if she couldn't quite comprehend what was happening. "What? What do you mean? I didn't do anything wrong," she protested, her voice rising in pitch. The security guard didn't flinch. "You've caused a disturbance, and we've received several complaints. We're asking you to leave now, or we'll have to escalate the matter." The older woman opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Her gaze shifted nervously, finally realizing that the situation had completely spiraled beyond her control. She shot a last, venomous glare at the young woman. "This isn't over," she spat, before turning away, muttering angrily under her breath. As the older woman was escorted out, the crowd slowly began to disperse. The tension that had hung thick in the air for so long started to lift, replaced by a sense of uneasy calm. The young woman stood, still gripping her phone, unsure of how to feel. She had won the confrontation, she had stood her ground, but something about the entire situation still didn't sit right. The man in the suit turned his attention to her then. His eyes were dark, unreadable. He moved toward her with purpose, and for a moment she tensed, her instinct telling her to brace for whatever was coming next. But instead of an attack, his voice was almost apologetic. "You handled that well," he said, his tone softer now. "But I'm afraid there's more to this than you know." The words caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer immediately, instead glancing around the store as if making sure no one was listening. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "This whole thing, it wasn't random. You weren't just an innocent bystander in all of this." Her heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising. "What do you mean I wasn't random?" The man glanced at the security guard who had spoken to the older woman and then nodded toward the back of the store, signaling for them to leave the area. The young woman's curiosity surged, but there was also a deep unease growing inside her. This was supposed to be over. She had stood up for herself, won the battle. But now, this man, this stranger, was telling her there was something she didn't know. He turned back to her, his gaze intense. "The woman who confronted you. She wasn't just some random customer. She was hired. Paid to cause trouble for you." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. She blinked, trying to process what he was saying. "Hired? What are you talking about?" she asked, her mind racing. The man's eyes softened slightly, as if he understood how overwhelming it was. "It's a scheme, a tactic some people use to discredit certain individuals, to make them look like the aggressors in situations like this." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. "You were being targeted." A chill ran down her spine. All this time, she had thought she was standing up for herself, fighting back against an irrational and hateful person. But the truth was far darker. The woman's insults, the escalation of the confrontation, everything had been part of something much bigger, something planned, and she had unknowingly walked right into it. Her breath caught in her throat. "Why? Why me? What could I possibly have done?" The man stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. "Because they knew you would fight back. They knew that you wouldn't let someone like her silence you. You were a perfect target." She stumbled back, shaking her head. "But why would anyone?" "You were meant to be a lesson," he interrupted. "A test. To see if someone like you could be broken." The weight of the words hung in the air between them. She was still trying to understand it all, trying to make sense of the pieces that didn't fit. She had walked into this store that day, thinking it would be just another routine visit. But now, it felt like everything had been carefully orchestrated, every moment leading her here. Just as she opened her mouth to ask another question, something unexpected happened. A man's voice suddenly rang out from the back of the store, a sharp, almost eerie tone. It wasn't the store manager, and it wasn't any of the security guards. It was someone else. Someone the young woman recognized. And that's when the final twist hit her. The voice that rang out from the back of the store was one that the young woman recognized immediately. It was the voice of someone she had once trusted, someone she thought she knew well. Her heart sank as the realization hit her. It wasn't just a random attack. It wasn't just some faceless stranger pulling strings behind the scenes. This had been planned by someone close to her, someone she had never suspected. The man in the suit must have noticed the shift in her expression, because he looked over at her with something like sympathy, but it was quickly replaced by an expression of concern. "You didn't know, did you?" he asked, his voice softer now. The young woman shook her head, feeling dizzy. No, I didn't." She could hardly breathe as the words formed in her mind, the horrible truth settling in her chest like a heavy weight. The person behind all of this, the one who had orchestrated it all, was someone she had trusted. Someone who knew her. Her mind raced as she took a few steps toward the back of the store, the man following closely behind. She was barely aware of the people still milling around, the hushed whispers that echoed through the aisles. The store had become a stage for a drama she had never asked for, and yet here she was, caught in the middle of it. She walked faster now, the familiar voice growing louder, more distinct with every step. When she reached the back, she didn't know what she expected. But what she saw shocked her to her core. Standing there, casually leaning against the back counter, was someone she hadn't seen in months. Someone she never thought would be involved in something like this. Her former friend, the one she had once confided in, the one who had been by her side through thick and thin, now stood before her with a faint, almost smug grin. "Surprised to see me?" the woman asked, her tone almost mocking, as if she were enjoying this twisted game. The young woman stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to yell, to confront her, but the words stuck in her throat. How could this person, who had once been such a close ally, turn against her so completely? "You," the young woman finally managed to say, her voice low, tremulous. "Why? Why would you do this?" Her former friend pushed herself off the counter, stepping closer. There was no warmth in her eyes, no sign of the person she had once known. "It was easy," she said, her voice now carrying a chilling detachment. "You've always been so predictable. I knew exactly how you'd react. And I knew exactly what it would take to get you to fight back." The young woman took a step back, her mind reeling. "But why? What did I ever do to you?" she asked, her voice cracking. The former friend let out a cold laugh. "You were always the one with the spotlight, weren't you? Always the one people admired, always the one everyone went to. It was easier to stay in the shadows, but when I saw how much attention you were getting, how everyone just flocked to you, I realized something." She paused, letting the silence hang between them. "I realized I wanted that. I wanted to be the one in control for once. And when I saw the opportunity to bring you down, to make you look like the villain, I took it." The young woman couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had never imagined that someone she had once considered a friend could be capable of such manipulation, such betrayal. The anger bubbled up inside her, but it wasn't just anger at her former friend. It was anger at herself, too. How had she been so blind? How had she not seen the signs? The man in the suit stepped forward, breaking the silence. "I'd been tracking her for months," he said, his voice now serious, even dark. "This was all part of a larger scheme. You were targeted because they knew you'd be the one to make waves, to take a stand. The woman in the store wasn't just an agent, she was part of a network of people hired to create chaos, to turn public opinion. You were always the goal. You just didn't know it." The young woman turned to him, feeling the weight of his words. She could hardly process everything. "So this was all just a game to you?" she asked, looking at both of them in disbelief. "You think this is just a joke?" Her former friend smirked. "It's not a joke, sweetheart. It's survival. You can't stay on top forever. And when you're so visible, when you make so many people pay attention, there's always someone waiting to take you down." The young woman's breath hitched as the truth started to sink in. This wasn't just a petty grudge. This was a calculated attempt to destroy her, to take everything she had worked for, to tear down everything she stood for. And it had almost worked. Almost. She felt a fire ignite within her, something deeper than anger. It was the urge to fight back, to reclaim everything she had lost. "You can't take me down," she said, her voice filled with newfound strength. "Not like this." Her former friend laughed again, but it was hollow, like the sound of someone realizing they had lost control. You'll regret this, she spat, turning to leave. But the young woman wasn't done yet. No, she said, stepping forward. I'm done being the victim. You don't get to ruin my life, not anymore. And I'm going to make sure people know what you did. All of it. With a final glare, her former friend disappeared into the back hall, her footsteps fading into the distance. The young woman stood there, trembling with the weight of everything that had just been revealed. But there was no time to dwell on it. Not now. She had a choice to make. Turning back to the man in the suit, she took a deep breath. So, what happens now? He regarded her with something like respect in his eyes. Now? Now you walk away. You don't let this define you. You use their attempts to break you, to fuel your next move. You're stronger than they thought. Stronger than you know. The young woman nodded slowly. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. She had no idea what would happen next, or how she would move forward. But one thing was certain, she wasn't going to let anyone dictate her future anymore. As she walked toward the door, leaving behind the chaos of the store, she glanced over her shoulder. She had faced the storm, stood her ground, and come out stronger on the other side. The battle wasn't over, but she was no longer fighting alone. She had her voice, and she wasn't going to let anyone silence it. Outside, the cool air felt like a new beginning. The sun was setting, casting a soft glow over the world, as if to mark the end of one chapter and the start of another. And as she stepped out into the fading light, she knew that no matter what came next, she would face it with courage. The story of what happened in that store would be told, of course, but it wouldn't be the final chapter. It would just be one more page in the journey of reclaiming her own power. And this time, she wouldn't back down. Not ever again. With one last look at the store, she walked away into the unknown, but with a heart full of strength and a determination to keep moving forward. The world had thrown its punches, but she was still standing. And that was all that mattered.